Hey nerds, what's up? It's been 6 decades since The Lord of the Rings was published, and the question is it overrated or does it still hold up? I'll be answering that question after the jump. So, I actually think I read Lord of the Rings much later than most people in life. I think a lot of people tend to read it in elementary school or junior high. But long before my book before movie rule, I saw these movies as a young adolescent and fell in love with them. But I also heard quite frequently that the movies took all the best parts of the books and left out all the bad parts. So I kind of grew up not thinking I missed out on anything. And in fact, it left me with a dual impression of J.R.R. Tolkien. Because as we know, Tolkien is widely regarded as the father of modern high fantasy. He really ushered in a new era of fantasy authors. We think Tolkien ran so that the likes of Rowling and Martin and Jordan and Sanderson could walk. But this begs the question, do modern fantasy authors improve on Lord of the Rings? Was that just a good blueprint for our modern fantasy and just kind of doesn't hold up and is antiquated and isn't as good as the modern stuff? Now, this is the attitude I sort of went into reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings several years ago. I thought, I'm going to read this book and prove that it's overrated now and that it was good for its time period, but now we have something better. Now, I don't think you probably need a stats degree to know that it's a terrible way to go into an experiment expecting a certain result and trying to find it, but I highlight this attitude because it really emphasizes my actual opinion on the matter, which is no, The Lord of the Rings is not overrated. In fact, it is a stunning piece of artwork from beginning to end. I loved every single thing about it. I thought it was beautifully written, beautifully paced, the characters were incredible. It is just a work of fantasy art, and it definitely holds up 6 decades later, and I think it will be, as it already has, just a generational classic. So today in this video, I'm actually going to talk about the common criticisms I heard about The Lord of the Rings before I read it, and why I think those criticisms exist, and why I don't necessarily agree with them. So let's jump into it. Number 1, there's weird stuff in it, like Tom Bombadil. Guys, stop saying Tom Bombadil is weird. It's not that weird. I don't know if it's just because my expectations were set so high since I'd heard so much that Tom Bombadil is weird, but it just seemed very average for fantasy. Like, it just doesn't seem that weird at all. We need to stop saying this. Tom Bombadil is not that weird. Now, I do think there's a reason for this criticism, and I think the reason is that Lord of the Rings is probably one of the most read fantasies other than maybe Harry Potter. It's very cross-genre. A lot of people who don't normally read fantasy or science fiction are picking up Lord of the Rings because of its cultural impact and its, canon in literature. And so I think people who aren't used to reading fantasy, things like Tom Bombadil, and maybe younger people will think that that is more weird. But if you generally read fantasy, there's nothing in The Lord of the Rings that's any weirder than anything else I've read in fantasy. And in fact, if you can live through Elaine and Aviendha becoming first sisters or whatever, and basically the last half of A Wise Man's Fear, that stuff was a lot weirder than Tom Bombadil. So I definitely think that The Lord of the Rings is pretty average when it comes to fantasy. Number 2, there are so many poems and songs and they're so long and unrelated to anything. I heard complaints about the songs and poems in Lord of the Rings so much, I was just so expecting to want to skip pages. I honestly don't really have a defense for this, or a very good defense, other than that there just aren't that many songs, and they're not that long. I think the longest poem was 2 or 3 pages. It wasn't very long, and they were all very relevant to the story. There was never a time I was like, why is this being told to me? It all made sense for the tone and the idea of the story. So again, I don't know if this is just because I read a lot of fantasy, and that kind of world building and lore building is very common, but I really don't understand this criticism because I just don't feel like they came up very often. Number 3, the Scouring of the Shire was too long and unnecessary. Now, this is a criticism I still hear a lot to this day. Everyone seems happy that the movies ended on a different note and we never see the Scouring of the Shire. So I didn't know anything about what it was until I read the book. And I was expecting to totally hate it. I just kept anticipating it. I knew it was going to come at the end of the last novel, and so I was just preparing to hate this. And instead, it was one of my favorite parts of the entire novel. I am so confused at why people complain about this. I think the Scouring of the Shire, I understand why people might not like it because it's sad. Obviously we don't love it that they come back and the Shire's ruined. That's a very sad moment. But the character development that's displayed in that scene, it's so worth it. it brings the whole story full circle, because when the hobbits are leaving the Shire, they are scared and kind of helpless and they don't know what's going on. And now as they're returning to the Shire and they see it overrun with, regular evil. And I just love this scene where they're all laughing and they're not even afraid and everyone's expecting them to be scared. And they're basically like, geez, compared to Sauron, this is nothing. Like, all of them have had these experiences that made them tougher and more worldly, and being able to see the contrast of that was just so incredible. And I think the book wouldn't nearly be as strong. Like, you would really miss out on something without that. And in fact, I understand why the movies don't put it in. They're already long enough, but I do think it's a very cool moment that you get in the books and nowhere else. And I don't understand why anyone wouldn't want it. So those are the most common criticisms I hear against The Lord of the Rings, and I personally don't agree with any of them now that I've read it, but I want to know what you think, especially if you're a common fantasy reader. Like, did you think what I thought about them just being these gorgeous novels that are so wonderful? Or were you kind of on the other side, like, no, I think the movies are better. I didn't really like all the additions. I definitely loved them. I got very emotional when I finished the books, which is something that doesn't happen to me almost ever, because I felt like I was going to miss the characters because they were just so well written. So I want to hear your thoughts about The Lord of the Rings below. I definitely don't think they're overrated. If you want to see what I'm currently reading, please check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. And if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. I want to hear what you have to say, and I will see you next time. Bye.